They have different voices, perspectives, and took separate paths. But when it pertains to the lack of Black representation on screen, their feeling is resoundingly the same. Words like
frustrating.
Frustrating.
I would say forgotten. If I had to do one word, or unseen.
These three women grew up not seeing many people who looked like them on their television screen. Three of the most prominent Black voices within Canadian media: Kayla Grey of TSN, Jessica Smith of CTV Your Morning, and Joelle Tomlinson of CTV Morning Live Calgary. But until the spring of 2020, Black faces, voices, and stories were rare in Canadian media.
In the news space, there were a few giants, and I'm thinking like Drummond, Tracy Moore, Marcy Ian, when I reflect on what the sports industry looked like. And that's like where I wanted to be. And I just did not see Black women in the space specifically.
Kind of getting into it and growing up, there wasn't really a ton. So I figured, you know what, I'm going to get into this thing and see how it goes. And if there isn't a lane for me, I will do my best to create one.
It was quite obvious to me that I looked different, but I didn't have any representation either. So I think at that point, it was just almost a blissful ignorance. And as I got older, certain things started happening where I did wonder about my culture, and I wondered where we were.
This man kneeled on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Can you imagine that?
The murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 shocked the world and brought systemic Black racism sharply into focus, leading to Black Lives Matter marches around the planet and calls for change from beyond Black communities. But almost 2 years later, according to a recent KPMG study, 52% of Black Canadians feel nothing has changed when it comes to job prospects, leaving many feeling unrepresented, underutilized, and unheard.
Felt like our magic wasn't being put on full display. I think I'm just frustrated for those that were in this space, couldn't fully show up as themselves, and that not being because they were scared, but more so as a means of survival.
It's something that I've seen change quite a bit over the past couple of years, but we still have a really long way to go when it comes to seeing equal representation across the board. And it doesn't feel so much like oh my gosh, it's so nice to see like so and so in this role. It just becomes a regular everyday thing.
You're only going to be stronger by adding more voices and more perspectives and more experiences and more culture.
In 2009, India Arie sang "I Am Not My Hair," a sentiment that hits home with Grey, Smith, and Tomlinson. A 2021 research study sponsored by Dove found 1 in 2 Black girls will experience hair discrimination.
Yeah, Google better fix up, because if you Googled unprofessional, it's Black hair types that are the first that come up. And that's heartbreaking.
I think all hair is professional. From the onset of just the news in general, you've seen this kind of set mold for what a news anchor, whether it's male or female, is supposed to look like. Curls are like snowflakes, they're all very unique.
It gets tangled. It's not considered professional. It was never sleek. It would never really react to the way that I wanted it to look. So I struggled with that. It took until about my late 20s to really start embracing my curls and seeing it as, yes, acceptable, yes, professional. And if people were offended by it, where does that come from? Because that's just an idea that people have, that only one look equates success or intelligence or someone worth listening to.
Since 1996, the Canadian Association of Black Journalists has helped open spaces for Black journalists in the country's newsrooms. Atlantic Director Brian Daly is at the forefront, advocating for diversity in Canadian media.
Working in the industry, you're sometimes isolated. I know that I worked in the industry for 25 years. I rarely had Black colleagues, even though I worked in Toronto and Montreal and Halifax, which are cities that have large Black populations. That's because of the underrepresentation. So you're isolated, you're working on a day-to-day basis without the support of your people. So the CABJ, we do our best to fill that gap. Sometimes it's just as simple as taking a phone call, and we can, speak in a very honest and vulnerable way as Black Canadians, because we share some of the same experiences. We also advocate to the journalism schools to make sure that you're recruiting people of color, Black people, in the case of the CABJ, into journalism schools where the underrepresentation is quite stark, and in some cases has actually gotten worse since the 90s.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
The world has a long way to go to reach the promised land heralded by Dr. Martin Luther King, but the future is starting to look brighter.
I'm excited to see the change coming, and I think there's a lot to be said about this next generation of leaders that have kind of like a handle on inclusivity.
I am not the first, and I hope that I am definitely not the last, because I think it's a collective that we have to kind of see this thing change across the board, where it just becomes normal. You know, you turn on your TV regardless of who you're watching, where you're watching from, that you see yourself represented.
I think ultimately my goal moving forward is to make sure I'm not the last in whatever I do. It's not important for like our age group, but our kids. To see that in this space, in this media landscape, they can show up in different roles and be incredibly impactful in storytelling.
And what words come to mind for these journalists when they think of the future?
I'm happy, but I'm not satisfied.
Hope.
Hopeful and empowered.
Belief.